Testament. We did Zechariah. So I tell you a week advance so that you have enough time to find Malachi before service next Sunday. But we're going to do a few weeks through Malachi entitled Fresh Faith. And so I encourage you all to be here. But today, as I said, we're wrapping up our series entitled Guardrails, about how we have been talking about how we need guardrails in so many different areas of our lives to keep our lives from going off into the danger zone. And today we're going to be in Proverbs chapter 4. It happened a few weeks ago. My dad lives in Western Pennsylvania, and so every time I go to visit him, I always put his address into my GPS. And if you remember the last few weeks, I've talked about my proclivity to get lost very easily and how I need my GPS, but I don't necessarily need my GPS to get to my dad's house. I'm not afraid of getting lost, but I like using my GPS because Google Maps will tell you if there's road closures or speed traps or road construction and things like that. So I always put my dad's address in before I go to his house. And so a couple weeks ago, I was on my way. I put his town in my GPS, and I started going up I-99 here, and I was getting ready to get off of Bald Eagle to go across to Western PA. And I looked down at my GPS, and it told me that my estimated time of arrival would be 13 hours. Typically only takes about 2 hours to get there. And I thought, what is going on? Is there a lot of road closures? Like, I don't even know if I want to go today if it's going to take me 13 hours to get there. And so after a little bit of investigation on my GPS, I discovered that instead of putting in Eau Claire, Pennsylvania, I put in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, okay? There are only 4 towns in all of America called Eau Claire, and I chose the wrong one, okay? And so I was going to end up, if I had followed those directions, I was going to end up 767 miles away from my intended destination. And what I learned that day was this, is that if you put bad data into your GPS, you're going to end up in a place that you never intended being. If you put the right data into your GPS, you'll end up at your intended destination. And as I think about that story, I think about how similar that is in our lives, right? If we put bad stuff into our minds, if we put bad stuff into our hearts, oftentimes it's going to lead us, and we're going to end up in places that we ultimately regret being. But if we put the right things into our heart, if we put the right things into our mind, then we're going to end up in a place where there's going to be a lot less regrets in our lives. And so as we wrap up this series on guardrails, the truth that I want to give you today as we wrap this up, as you take it home today, is just simply this, is that what you think today, you will become tomorrow. So whatever you think about, whatever you dwell upon, whatever's in your heart, whatever's in your mind today, ultimately is who you're going to become tomorrow, right? If you put the bad stuff in, if you put the bad stuff in your mind, if you put the bad stuff into your heart, you're going to end up in a bad place. If you put the right stuff in, if you put the right stuff into your mind, the right stuff into your heart, you're going to end up in a place where you're going to have fewer regrets. And so I saved this message intentionally for the last one in our series on guardrails, because I think if we get this one right, it'll help us in all the other areas of our life. We've talked about how you and I need guardrails around our time and sexuality and all those things. But if we get this one right, it'll help us to develop the guardrails in the other areas of our life. Because what you think today is what you will become tomorrow. So as we wrap up this series, I want to bring you up to speed, get you up to date to where we've been. If you've not been here, if you forgot where we've been the last few weeks. So I started this series several weeks ago, and I just talked about the importance of having guardrails in your life, that no one needs a guardrail until they do, okay? And so you can drive along a road and you can ignore the guardrails, and you don't really need the guardrails until one day you start to go into the danger zone. Then you're going to be really glad the guardrail is there. And so I shared with you that first week in the book of Proverbs, and I encouraged you as we went through this series that as we talk about guardrails, it's not always just right or wrong, but what's the wise thing for me to do? And I encourage you to continue to ask that question. What's the wise thing for me to do in light of my past, in light of my present, in light of my future hopes and dreams? What's the wise thing for me to do? Because if we place guardrails in our lives, guardrails will direct and protect. They'll direct us in the right direction. They'll protect us from going off into the wrong direction. The second week of the series, we talked about time, and Doug shared with you about how our days are numbered. And so because of that, you and I need to number our days. And oftentimes we live as if we're going to have all the time in the world. But the truth is that we don't. And we encourage you that week, right? What are some things you need to add to your schedule? What are some things that you need to subtract from your schedule? Some things that maybe you need to increase doing, some of the things that maybe you need to decrease doing. Because your days are numbered, you need to number your days. Okay, the third week, we went on in our series and we talked about how you and I should flee from sexual sin. That this is that one sin that's unlike any other sin that we commit. And you and I need these guardrails around our lives morally, around our lives sexually, to keep us from going off into the danger zone. And then last week, we talked about finances, and we talked about how money can steal from you. That if we don't master our money will master us, and how you and I need guardrails on how we obtain money, how we spend our money, how we save our money, how we give our money. And so we need those guardrails. And so today we're wrapping this up in Proverbs chapter 4, and we're going to see what you think today is who you will become tomorrow. And this whole series, and it's the verse that we're going to look at today, it comes from Proverbs chapter 4, verse 23. You all have it memorized now. This has now been 5 weeks. You all have it memorized. So I don't even know why I needed to put it on the screen here, but let's all say it together. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Watch over your heart with all diligence, for from it flow the springs of life. Okay, that's the verse that we're going to look at today, and how important it is in our lives if we are going to develop guardrails, because what you and I think today is what we will become tomorrow. And so we're going to look at these couple verses here in Proverbs chapter 4, verse 23. And as we begin, the very first thing that we see is the command to guard our hearts. That Solomon gave his son a very short, a very succinct command to guard his heart. And by extension, that's for you and I today. It was a command that was intended really to guide our lives, to direct and to protect our lives. And so it begins in verse 23 with this phrase, watch over your heart. Now, some of you may have a version of the Bible that translates that word watch as to keep or to guard. It's the idea there, and it's written in such a way that it's an imperative, which means it's a command. This wasn't a suggestion. This wasn't just simply good advice. It was a command that Solomon was giving to his son. He said, I want you to watch. I want you to guard. I want you to protect your heart. Now, the original Hebrew word there was a word that was intended to mean to protect from danger. It was the idea of somebody who was protecting something extremely valuable to them. One of my favorite restaurants to go to is Eaton Park, and Beth will go with me every once in a while. And every time we go to Eaton Park together, Beth always buys the same, she always orders the same meal every time we go to Eaton Park. She gets the turkey club sandwich, and she has a side of fries with it. And every time she orders that, every time the waitress brings the food to the table, like I look over at her side of the table, and those crispy golden French fries are just so tempting. And every time I sit there, my mouth starts to salivate, and I'm like, why didn't I get the French fries? And so every time we sit there, I reach over to grab a French fry from Beth's plate, and my hand is immediately met with a slap from her hand. And what she's doing is she's watching over her French fries, okay? It's the idea when we watch over our heart, when we watch over something, when we watch over our hearts, it's the idea of influencing our heart and our mind towards the things of God. It's protecting our hearts and minds from the contamination of things that would draw our hearts and our minds and ultimately our lives away from God. And so Solomon gave this very brief, this very succinct command, and he said, watch over your heart. But then Solomon went on and he explained how we are to do this. He said, watch over your heart with all diligence. He said, we're to do this with all diligence. And actually, in the original language, that last phrase is actually at the beginning of the sentence. And in Hebrew, when a writer would write something at the beginning of a sentence, it was written that way to demonstrate emphasis. And so Solomon, in his wisdom, was writing with emphasis, and he literally said, with all diligence, watch over your heart. The command is to watch over our heart. And Solomon said, I want you to do this with all diligence. Now, I've had a good friend who told me one time that all means all the time, and that's all means. Like, it means all the time. And he says, with all diligence. Now, this is what I find fascinating about this word diligence. In the original Hebrew, it's a word that meant confinement. And so you could read this, and he says, with all confinement, watch or guard over your heart. And you're like, well, what does that mean? It was the same word that was used of a prison guard who would sit and watch over the prisoners. It was a word that was used for security that would sit maybe in a bank and watch to make sure nobody would steal the money or the precious metals. And it's the idea of making sure nothing escapes with all diligence. A few weeks ago, as you know, we were in Tunisia. And one of the days we were walking through the really crowded market streets of Tunisia, and I had my phone in my back pocket, and Pastor John said, hey, are you sure you want to keep your phone in your back pocket? Because really easy for somebody to steal that. And I was like, oh, good point. You know, I grew up in a town of 300 people. I never had to worry about that. And so when he told me that, I took my phone and I took my wallet and I put them in my front pockets. And I walked through all the streets that day with my hands in my front pockets, because I was watching over my phone, I was watching over my wallet with all diligence, okay? And that's the same idea that's carried through in this verse when Solomon said, I want you with all diligence to watch over your heart. And we're to do it with all diligence because watching over our heart is sometimes a very difficult task. Because in Jeremiah chapter 17, there, through the prophet Jeremiah, God made this statement. He said, the heart is deceitfully wicked above all things. Who can know it? Like our heart has this tendency to always want to drift into the danger zone. Our heart that's left unchecked without guardrails is ultimately, eventually going to go over the cliff. It's going to end up in a ditch. And so Solomon, in his wisdom, he knew the proclivity and the tendency of the human heart. And so he said, he commanded, he said, with all diligence, day in and day out, watch over your heart, because what you think today is what you will become tomorrow. But then Solomon went on, he gave the reason you and I are to guard our heart. It's not just simply because it's a difficult task, but watching over our heart with all diligence is a very, very important task. And the importance of that task is found in the next verse, or in the next phrase of this one verse. He said, watch over your heart with all diligence, because from it flow the springs of life. We're to watch over our heart with all diligence, because out of our heart flow the springs, and literally the issues, the good, the bad, the positive, the negative, all of the issues of life flow out of our hearts and our minds. And so he said, for that reason, I want you to watch over them with all diligence, because the overflow of our lives comes from our hearts and our minds. Let me ask you, if somebody lies, what do you call them? Yeah, this isn't a trick question. Yeah, a liar, okay? If somebody cheats on their spouse, what do you call them? A cheater. Yeah, if somebody steals, what do you call them? Yeah, a thief, not a stealer. They're playing Sunday this afternoon, okay? It's a thief. That's what we always say, that if you do these things, if you lie, then you're a liar. If you cheat, you're a cheater. If you steal, then you're a thief. But what Solomon is saying is that's not the way it works. The reason we lie is because we're already liars. The reason we cheat is because we're already cheaters. The reason we steal is because we're already not stealers. We're already thieves. What he's saying here, he's saying we need to watch over our hearts because every issue in our life flows out of it. And he said everything that is the outflow in your life ultimately comes from your heart and from your mind. Have you ever been in a situation where somebody just irritated you so bad and you said something and you shouldn't have said it, and then you immediately said, "Oh, I didn't mean to say that." Okay? Well, that's baloney, okay? What you should have said is, "Oh, I didn't mean to say that out loud," okay? Because I said it because it was already in here, okay? Or maybe you get caught lying and you say, "Well, I didn't mean to lie." No, that's not true. I didn't mean to lie and get caught lying, okay? The reason why we lie is because it's already in here. Jesus made this exact same statement in Matthew chapter 12, verse 34. He said, the mouth speaks out of what fills the heart. So what comes out of our mouth is just simply resembling what's already in our heart. I know I've told this story to you before, but I was just reminded of it a few weeks ago. Somebody said, "Hey, there's a few things I remember, and one of them is the Kool-Aid story." And so I'm going to share the Kool-Aid story with you again. But there was a couple years ago, I was at home by myself. Beth and the kids had gone somewhere, and so one of my favorite meals is chicken patty sandwiches with like the processed American cheese slices on potato bread. Like that is like my favorite meal. So they were gone, so that's what I was eating, and I filled up my glass all the way to the top with grape Kool-Aid. And so I had made that in the kitchen. I was walking to the living room, and in our living room was this big white area rug. Okay, you kind of know where this is going, right? Okay, and as I'm walking in the living room, the dog jumped up on my leg, and when it jumped on my leg, it kind of jostled me, and guess what came out of my glass? Grape Kool-Aid. Why did grape Kool-Aid come out of my glass? Because that was what was already in there. And the same is true in our hearts and in our minds and in our lives, especially when we get bumped and jostled in life. What comes out of us is just simply a reflection of what's already inside of us. So that's why Solomon said, you need to watch over your heart with all diligence, for from it flow the springs of life. Because what you think today is what you will become tomorrow. And eventually, whatever's on the inside is going to actually work itself to the outside. So, because that one verse is true, what should you and I do? And Solomon anticipated that you all would ask that question. So the next few verses, Solomon gave some very practical applications on how you and I can watch over our hearts with all diligence. And the application I want to give you today is, if you're going to really consider this, is just simply to guard the gateways of your heart. If we're going to watch over our hearts with all diligence, because from it flow the springs of life, you and I need to guard the gateways of our heart. And like I said, in the next few verses, Solomon discussed and wrote about what these gateways look like and how you and I can guard the gateways that ultimately lead to our heart. And the first gateway that he said you and I are to guard is our ear gate. Okay? Whatever goes into our ears is eventually going to go into our mind and into our heart. And so you and I need to monitor what goes into our ear gates. Look at what he said in verse 24. He said, watch over your heart with all diligence, for from it flow the springs of life. Verse 24, therefore put away from you a deceitful mouth and put devious speech far from you. He said, if you're going to guard your heart, if you're going to watch over your heart, if you're going to keep your heart safe, you need to put away from you a deceitful mouth and devious speech. That word deceitful is literally translated a crooked mouth. That is a mouth that lies. It includes, but is not limited to, lying, blaspheming God, It includes gossip and all of those things related to having a crooked mouth. He said, I want you to put all of those things away from your ears. You don't need to listen to lying. You don't need to listen to gossip. You don't need to listen to people who are spewing hate towards other people. He said, put those things away from you. And then he went on, he said, and also put devious speech far from you. That word devious is a word that's translated perverse, which again is included but not limited to crude language, filthy joking, things that just speak perversity in our culture. He said, you need to put those things far from you, because if you listen to a deceitful mouth, if you listen to devious speech, it's going to enter your ear gate. And it's going to reside in your heart and in your mind. And if it resides there, eventually it's going to work its way out, because what you think today is what you will become tomorrow. When I was in 6th grade, there was a kid that lived down the road from us. He lived on the next farm over from ours, and he was 3 years older than me. And so one day on the school bus on the way home, he said, hey, I got this cassette tape. You know, some of you, cassette tapes came after records and 8-track tapes. Okay, so those of you are like, and the other side of you, they came before compact discs and streaming services. So I was kind of in that sweet spot between most of you here today. Okay, and so he said, hey, I got this cassette tape you and I need to listen to. So he brought it over, we put it in my tape recorder, and it was stand-up comedy from like the 1980s of Eddie Murphy. Now, Eddie Murphy today is known for some pretty good family films, and but back in the 1980s, Eddie Murphy was anything but that, okay? And so we listened to this Eddie Murphy cassette tape, and the first time I listened to it, I was like, I have never heard words like that before in my life. And so we just kept listening to this tape day after day after day. Then one morning, about a month or so later, I was getting ready for school and I was pouring milk on my cereal, and I spilled the milk on the kitchen floor. And one of those words that I had heard Eddie Murphy say came out of my mouth. Because what you think today is what you will become tomorrow. So it came out of my mouth, and my mom, who was sitting at the kitchen table that morning, I immediately looked at her. Yeah, and all those looks that you just gave me is what she gave me. Her eyes were this big around. And she said, where did you hear that word? That was right before she rubbed my tongue with a bar of soap. Like, she literally did that. Like, I'd always heard that. I'd never experienced, like, I never thought it was true until I was in 6th grade. My mom actually rubbed my tongue with a bar of soap. And the truth is, right? The reason why it came out of my mouth was because that's what I was listening to. Some of you need to guard your ear gate, which means maybe some of you need to get up from the break table at work and just leave the room. Some of you may need to change the music you're listening to. Some of you may need to listen. Some of you may need to turn off cable news. Like, just stop listening to those things. Because what you think today is what you will become tomorrow. So you need to guard the gateway, your ear gate, from those things getting in there. The second thing that Solomon said you and I need to guard, the second gateway, is our eye gate. We need to guard the eye gate. He said, again, in verse 23, watch over your heart with all diligence, for from it flow the springs of life. Put away from you a deceitful mouth, and put devious speech far from you. Verse 25, let your eyes look directly ahead, and let your gaze be fixed straight in front of you. He said here, you and I need to be mindful of what we look at. And he's basically saying you need to look directly ahead. You need to keep your gaze fixed straight ahead of you. Now, all of you probably know that if you drive over the mountain over here, okay? If you drive over the mountain, you're going to be in like the heart of an Amish community there in Sinking Valley. And if you drive around the roads there for any length of time, eventually you're going to see a buggy being pulled by a horse. And if you look closely at that horse, what's that horse have on its face? It has blinders on both sides of its face, because we know that what a horse sees will affect its behavior. Solomon said, in the same way, what you and I look at, what you and I gaze at, will eventually affect our behavior. And so he said, literally, maybe literally, we need to go through life with blinders on our eyes so that we look directly ahead, so that our gaze is fixed straight in front of us. And so when we think about guardrails, maybe putting guardrails around our eyes, listen, some of you may need to change the TV channel. Some of you may need to stop watching the movies that you're watching. Some of you may need to change the literature, the books, and the magazines that you're reading. Some of you may need to stop looking at the websites that you're looking at. Because that eye gate is a gateway to your heart. And what you think today is what you will become tomorrow. And so you need to guard that gateway, the eye gate, to your heart. And then Solomon said, hey, there's a third gateway that you and I need to guard, and that is our social gate. We need to guard our social gate. I tell kids all the time, I've told my kids for a number of years growing up, your crew will influence you. Who you hang out with is who you're going to be like. So you hang out with people that are going the direction you want to go, and you're going to end up there. You hang out with people that are going in a direction you don't want to go, you're going to end up there as well, because your crew will influence you. And so Solomon said, you need to guard your social gate. Look at what he said. Again, let me just read all this in context. Watch over your heart with all diligence, for from it flow the springs of life. Put away from you a deceitful mouth, and put devious speech far from you. Let your eyes look directly ahead, and let your gaze be fixed straight in front of you. Watch the path of your feet, and all your ways will be established. Do not turn to the right nor to the left. Turn your foot from evil. If you were a kid one time, okay, I'm sure your parents asked you all the questions, like, where are you going? Who are you going with? When you get there, who's going to be there? If you're a parent, I'm sure that you've asked these questions of your children. Where are you going? Who are you going with? When you get there, who's going to be there? And my kids would always kind of push back on that, just like their father did with his parents, and just kind of push back on that. And I remember my daughter saying one time, she would say, and I would say, is that really the best person you should be hanging out with? Or is that the best place you should be going? And she would push back and say, Dad, you're just so judgmental. And my response was, no, I'm not being judgmental. I'm using good judgment. Because if you hang out with those people, that's who you're going to become like. Solomon said it as well. You need to watch where you're going. You need to watch who you're hanging out with. And this is good advice. This is good judgment, not just for children, but for all of us, right? I hear people all the time. Every time my husband hangs out with that friend, he always does foolish things. Or every time my loved one goes there, they always come back making a foolish decision. Because the truth is, this is a gateway to our heart. And what we think today is what we become tomorrow. So I want to encourage you to guard the gateways to your heart. You need to guard your ear gate. You need to guard your eye gate. You need to guard your social gates. Because what you think today is what you will become tomorrow. The Apostle Paul understood this truth as well. And so as I wrap up here, I just want to give you a couple verses from the New Testament. In Romans chapter 12, verse 2, there Paul wrote these words. He said, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may be able to prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. Notice what Paul said. He said, don't let the world, don't be conformed. Don't let the world squeeze you into its mold. But you be transformed. You be different. And he said, and look at what he said. This is how you do it. Not by changing your behavior, not by trying to, grit and bear it. He said, you do it by renewing your mind. You're transformed when you begin to think about different things, when you allow different things in your mind, and into your heart. Well, Paul, what are those things? Well, he went on here in the New Testament. He said this in Philippians 4:8. He said, finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is of good repute, if there is any excellence and if anything worthy of praise, dwell on these things. Think about them. Ruminate on them. Meditate on them. Dwell on these things. And as a result, you're going to change your mind. And as your mind is changed, it's going to change your attitude. And as your attitude is changed, it's going to ultimately change the behavior and the direction of your life. No wonder Solomon said thousands of years ago, watch over your heart with all diligence, for from it flow the springs of life. Because what you think today is what you will become tomorrow. So guard the gateways of your heart. And you will be glad that you did. Father, we thank you for your word today. I thank you that you have given us the ability and the opportunity to guard our heart, to watch over our heart with all diligence. And I pray for all of us in this room that we would see the importance and the value of guarding our hearts. And so I pray that we would be mindful of what we hear, mindful of what we see, mindful of who we hang out with and where we go, knowing that ultimately those are gateways to our hearts. And eventually, what we think today, we will become tomorrow. And so I pray that we would think on the things that are honorable and lovely and praiseworthy. Ultimately, that our minds would be changed and our lives would be transformed for your glory. And so I pray that you would just continue to work in us, continue to work through us for your name to be exalted and glorified. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.